They were explorers, scientists, peaceful, careful. Their ship had scanned this world a dozen times. No organic life, no artificial signals, no atmosphere movement beyond wind patterns. Just rock, dust, cold silence. So why was there rhythm beneath the soil? Why did the ground seem to breathe, ever so slightly, under their boots? Why did every echo they made feel like it wasn't fading away, but being absorbed? Lieutenant Kale noticed it first. The moss wasn't moss, it pulsed. The rocks weren't still, they twitched when you weren't looking. The sun didn't warm the planet. The planet created the light. Then the sensors changed, not because the planet had changed, but because the planet had started watching. They thought they had landed on a dead world, but the world had been asleep, and they were its alarm clock. The expedition crew had barely begun to assemble their temporary base when the first undercurrent of unease slipped into their bones, subtle and insidious, like a whisper beneath thought. The terrain, supposedly stable rock and compacted earth scanned by orbital drones, felt oddly pliant underfoot, as if the very ground pulsed with latent warmth in places, softening like flesh. Patches of terrain gave beneath their boots with a slight resistance, rebounding almost imperceptibly after each step, like a slow breath in the dirt. Lyran, the mission's lead botanist, wandered further from the drop zone under the pretense of collecting surface flora, though in truth it was the faint shimmer at the edge of her vision that pulled her toward the outcroppings. She knelt beside what looked like dry moss hugging a fractured slab of stone, but as she reached out, it recoiled, not fast like an animal, but slowly, methodically, drawing back into tiny folds like it anticipated her touch before it came. Startled, she ran a scan. No known chlorophyll, no photosynthesis, no root system, yet it responded to proximity like a sentient veil. She didn't tell the others yet. She wanted to understand it first, name it herself. 100 meters away, Engineer Rowe was busy probing a jagged ridge near the cliffs, where his tools began to pick up resonance from beneath the stone, a low-frequency hum, rhythmic and soft. Intrigued, he dug shallow trenches through the loose debris, brushing aside layers of dust and petrified lichen until his hand struck something cold and metallic. But this wasn't ancient infrastructure or buried salvage. The surface beneath was not inert. It throbbed faintly under his fingers, a dull thump-thump that mirrored a heartbeat, too regular, too alive. He froze, hand still pressed against it, feeling as if it were sinking with his own pulse, then pulled back instinctively, breath catching in his throat. That night, after the perimeter was sealed and the crew gathered in the temporary command tent, the wind outside slowed to a hush. The planet had no fauna, no insects, no birds, no predators. Just the sound of boots on soil and breath in helmets. At 3:17 base time, one of the crew, Marek, a field geologist, vanished without a sound. There was no alarm, no struggle, no sign of distress. He simply left the tent, suited up, and walked out into the darkness. When they reviewed the footage, a cold silence fell over them. The feed showed Marek strolling casually across the field, calm and unhurried. Then, without hesitation or stumble, he reached a patch of soft terrain, paused briefly as if waiting, and was slowly absorbed downward. The earth around him parted without force or noise, folding gently around his legs and waist, enveloping him like thick fog until only his head and shoulders remained, and then even that slipped away beneath the surface. No sign of panic, no effort to resist. It was as if he'd chosen to surrender to something calling from below. Rowe replayed the footage frame by frame, watching the soil deform not with the violent collapse of a sinkhole, but with the precision of a living membrane. It stretched around Marek's body in slow waves, like the moss Lyran had touched earlier, except this moss covered the entire ground. The crew convened in tense whispers, some rationalizing it as a delusion, perhaps a sleepwalk gone wrong. Others insisted it was a geological anomaly, a fluid pocket triggered by pressure. Lyran remained silent. She couldn't stop thinking about how the moss seemed to sense her thoughts, and how Marek's posture didn't scream confusion or fear. it whispered surrender. Ro, however, had already returned to the ridge, this time placing his entire palm on the thumping metal beneath the surface. The beat was stronger now. It was no longer faint. It was deliberate, echoing deeper with each moment, as if aware it had been discovered. Around the camp, small things began to shift. Tools left on the ground were found in different positions the next morning. Equipment was subtly rearranged. Data logs showed corrupted timestamps, and voices not belonging to any crew member echoed faintly in background audio. Even the stars overhead felt wrong. Unmoving, perfectly fixed in the sky, too symmetrical. Lyran documented her findings obsessively, but didn't send them back to Central Relay. Something about the air made her second-guess everything she recorded. The world around them didn't react to motion, but to stillness. When the crew stopped to rest, or paused long enough to forget vigilance, things moved. Not visibly, never in front of them, but the aftermath was unmistakable. Shifts in landscape contours. New, faint indentations in the soil. A pattern was forming. Something beneath was listening, feeling, learning. The moss wasn't just plant life. It was an interface. The ground wasn't just terrain, it was skin. And the rhythmic pulse Ro had found wasn't an anomaly. It was a signal. A pulse that connected every grain of soil, every strand of moss, every soft patch beneath their boots. The planet itself was watching, waiting, choosing. Marek wasn't the first. He had simply been the first to be chosen while still. Lyran found herself unable to sleep. Each time she closed her eyes, her dreams were filled with a dark, humming depth, a space beneath the earth with no light and no air. Only sensation, thought, presence. Something down there was vast and awake, not malicious but unfathomable, like being in the presence of a sleeping god whose breath moved continents. As the second night approached, the crew reduced their movement zones, placing proximity sensors and ground stability monitors. But even those began giving false readings, flickering between solid and liquid states. The planet was not geological. It was intentional. It did not communicate through sound or language, but through influence, subtle shifts in perception, the shaping of emotion. Ro began sketching shapes compulsively on his datapad, concentric spirals, biomechanical diagrams, things that didn't exist in any known archives. Lyran's journals became erratic, filled with metaphors that made no sense in context. It is not a place. It is a sleeper, she wrote, and we're the itch on its back. No one remembered writing the automated beacon that now blinked on the main console. It was broadcasting coordinates deeper into the interior to a region the orbital scans had failed to map. Ro claimed he dreamed of it before waking. Lyran claimed she never saw it before, but somehow knew where it led. The crew still clung to protocol, still denied what they had seen, still convinced themselves that Marek had slipped into a sinkhole. But deep down, in the quiet between thoughts, they all felt the same thing, that nothing here was accidental, and the land itself had begun to breathe a little louder. Kale had always been the most detached among them. A xenolinguist trained not only to interpret alien syntax, but to detect structure where others heard only noise. He believed in the quiet rigor of code and semiotics, not in superstition or fear. But since the night Marek vanished, something had changed, not just in the terrain, but in the space inside Kale's head. It began with a low pulse he assumed was an equipment hum, a subaudible thrum like faulty shielding. But the sound followed him even without gear, growing clearer, rhythmic. Not speech, not pattern, but an unmistakable cadence, like breath shaped into thought. It wasn't in any language Kale knew, yet it wasn't meaningless either. It moved through his mind with the weight of intent, as though someone, or something, was reaching for a way to be heard through him. Meanwhile, the camp had begun to unravel. Equipment, once reliable, now glitched at random intervals. Calibrated machines failed basic diagnostics, as if corrupted by invisible interference. The environmental scanner stationed near the mossy ridge overloaded in a silent flash, melting its casing outward like soft wax. When Ro pulled the last stored readings, the data made no sense, except for one horrifying anomaly, a biometric waveform, massive in scale, deeper than seismic but biological in nature. The reading was clear even through the static. Heart rate detected, source size estimated, several kilometers wide. There were no animals on the planet, no signals from the sky, no signs of artificial construction beyond the buried heartbeat metal. Whatever lived beneath them was not a creature. It was a structure of thought, and it had begun to think louder. The crew gathered in hushed tones, their faces lit by failing HUD displays and flickering perimeter lights. Some wanted to leave immediately, to call for extraction, to burn fuel if necessary. Others weren't ready to admit what was happening. Mara, the mission's operations lead, was the only one whose voice didn't shake. She reminded them that Marek was still missing. They owed him answers, and somewhere within her, a deeper instinct told her that leaving now wouldn't matter. If this planet could move, listen, take, then distance meant nothing. Rose suggested shutting down all non-essential systems to avoid further mechanical failure. But even as he spoke, static flooded his comms, and Kale's tablet rebooted itself with an interface no one recognized. Glyphs like spirals, some of which Kale had drawn in his sleep 2 nights before. Lyran stared at them too long and quietly whispered that she understood one of the symbols. Not logically, but emotionally, the way one recognizes a memory that doesn't belong to them. She couldn't explain it. None of them could. That night, despite all precautions, the crew slept. Some from exhaustion, others from a subtle pull they couldn't fight. Dreams came thick with heat and pressure. Images of tunnels made not of stone but of layered thought, echoing with pulses instead of air. Kale's dreams were not dreams at all. They were messages. He stood in a field of twitching moss under a sky stitched with veins of light, and something beneath whispered through the ground. Not words, not images, but the feeling of being watched and understood down to the chemical structure of his bones. When they awoke, no alarms had gone off, no tremors registered. Everything seemed still, until they checked the map. Their base, tent, supplies, beacon, vehicles had moved 7 meters to the east, without disturbing a single item inside. Soil beneath their boots was freshly churned, as if they'd been picked up and gently laid back down. No drag marks, no damage, no noise. It had moved them like pieces on a board with care. Roe refused to accept it, cycling through geospatial scans on 3 separate tools, but the data was conclusive. They were no longer where they'd gone to sleep. The moss surrounding them had reoriented, facing their new location, like leaves tracking the sun. It wasn't wind or slope or magnetism. It was behavior. Kale stepped out beyond the new perimeter, trying to replicate the dream symbols in the dirt, scratching them with a metal probe. As he completed a curve, the moss recoiled, not in fear but in recognition. The ground beneath the glyph vibrated, a low harmonic tremor like a voice warming its throat. He stumbled back, breath shallow, and didn't tell anyone what he'd felt. A presence not malicious, but immeasurably old and curious. That day, the planet's magnetic field spiked for 6 seconds. The onboard AI logged it as a freak geomagnetic storm, but Marin noticed something else. The waveform wasn't random. It mirrored human brainwaves under REM sleep. It wasn't a magnetic field anymore. It was neural. It was thought. The entire planetary crust, or perhaps deeper, was acting like a distributed intelligence. Electrical impulses rippling across the terrain in ways that mimicked dreaming. And they were inside it, not camping on land, but resting inside a skull. The machines failing, the hallucinations, the dreams, the moss, all were byproducts of proximity to something immense and conscious. The arguments grew louder in the tent that evening. Lyran insisted they stay long enough to understand what they'd disturbed, while Roe packed emergency launch protocols in silence. Kale sat apart, scribbling glyphs and hearing them hum faintly from the soil. Mara stayed up all night, reviewing every audio recording and satellite feed. What she discovered made her skin crawl. While they slept, not only had the base moved, but the stars in their sky had shifted slightly, just enough to register. Either the planet had rotated unnaturally, or something else was bending perception itself. That next morning, a line had been drawn, not on maps or terrain, but within the crew. Those who had heard the rhythm, and those who hadn't. Cale no longer answered questions directly. His eyes darted toward the moss more often than people. Lyran talked to her sample jars before unsealing them. Ro claimed he saw shadows under the surface glass of the ridge pulse in sync with his own heartbeat. Mara found herself asking questions out loud, even when no one was near. The base's motion had altered them, not changed who they were, but how they thought, like a key slipped into a lock that had always existed inside their minds. And beneath it all, the pulse continued. Deep, regular, patient. It had found them, not as invaders, not as prey, but as messengers. They had been drawn here not by mistake, but as catalysts. The planet was not passive. It was dreaming, learning, remembering. And somewhere far beneath, something vast had begun to stir. Not angry, not awake, but curious. By the third cycle, since the shift, the terrain no longer resembled terrain. What had once been classified as soft, moss-laden ground now behaved with a logic that defied topography and structure. It responded, not randomly, but rhythmically, spatially. When Mara deployed a drone to scan for geometric anomalies, it crashed 10 seconds after liftoff, not due to failure, but interference. Its path veered deliberately into the base's eastern boundary, where the soil had begun forming shallow grooves. Not erosion, not natural faulting. Shapes. Long, curling ridges in repeated configurations, some stretched over a dozen meters, others so small they seemed like fractals woven into the skin of the planet. Cale was the first to recognize them, not from any known language database, not from history or mathematics, but from his own drawings. 4 days now, he had been sketching compulsively in a notebook he no longer let others touch, and now the ground matched his scrawls exactly. Not copies, the same symbols, as if he hadn't been imagining them at all, but transcribing. Mara watched him from a distance, not interfering, not questioning, because something inside her feared the answer more than the silence. Cale knelt in the grooves for hours, fingers brushing dirt like braille, his eyes no longer searching for patterns but reading them. Eventually, he turned to the team and whispered a single sentence, not in awe but in resignation. You woke me. No one asked who me was. Ro, fighting a growing tremor in his hands, pulled Cale aside, demanding he explain. But Cale's gaze slid past him, distant and glassy. The phrase repeated itself in every new formation, etched in ridges, arranged in shifting stones, even mirrored in the pulse of heat from the moss itself. You woke me. Ro began analyzing data logs again, looking for patterns in environmental readings, gravimetric distortions, anything. What he found cracked the edge of his composure. The subsurface scans they'd been running, when inverted and run through biological signal processing filters, produced something that no planetary crust should ever emit: cellular activity. Not like microbes or plant life. Like tissue. Organized. Pulsing. Reactive. It didn't behave like a world shaped by tools. It was shaped by its own growth. Ro theorized aloud, not to be believed, but to force the thought into existence. The planet was not terraformed. It had not been built. It had been born. A biomechanical intelligence spanning kilometers, layered over epochs, indistinguishable from geology until awakened. They hadn't stumbled onto ancient ruins. They had entered a body that slept in stone and grew circuits out of rivers and root systems. The idea should have been unthinkable. But nothing around them now felt like it obeyed the same physics they trusted for survival. Ro's theory was confirmed in the most horrifying way imaginable. While searching through the scrambled backup drives of the missing crew member Marek, Mara discovered a corrupted cache of visual logs, residue from the helmet's onboard recorder, mostly static and motion blur. But one fragment remained intact. 17 seconds of stabilized footage. It began with Marek alone near the ridge, staring into a patch of moss that pulsed gently. Then the ground beneath him seemed to loosen, Not break, not collapse, loosen. It rippled like a membrane, softening with every beat, and he knelt as though mesmerized. His hand reached forward, disappearing past the surface as if dipping into warm water. Then his torso followed, then his head. He did not struggle. He did not scream. But the audio channel caught something else, not a voice, but a breathless whisper that looped through the feed. Not from a wreck, from inside the soil itself. 3 words. Still inside. Awake. Lyran vomited when she saw it. Ro unplugged the console and walked into the storm chamber to sit alone. Kale, when shown the footage, merely nodded. Not in horror, in understanding. Mara reviewed the footage 12 times. She slowed the frames, watched the moss close around Marek with no violence, no force, just absorption. He had not died. He had been taken, conscious, intact, and somewhere below. That changed everything. Extraction wasn't a solution anymore. There was no leaving in the traditional sense. Even if they escaped orbit, part of them would remain embedded in this place, not in body but in thought, in awareness. The terrain had begun responding to Kale's movements like muscle to nerve. When he walked near a ridge, the grooves unfolded. When he paused, the heat pattern shifted. When he slept, the symbols multiplied. The planet had chosen him, or perhaps grown him from the beginning. Lyra now feared touching anything without gloves. She claimed her dreams no longer came from her mind, but from a depth so old it had no words, just feelings. Loss, anticipation, hunger not for food, but for memory. She described being watched not from above or afar, but from within her skull, a gaze like gravity pulling thoughts out through the marrow. One morning, Ro discovered the base's internal temperature had risen exactly 3 degrees, without triggering any sensors. Every control panel still displayed nominal readings, but his instruments told another story. The base was being held in a bubble of altered atmosphere, like being inside a lung. That same day, the stars above them flickered, not because of dust or cloud, but because the sky itself shimmered with refracted light. The crust of the planet, somehow, was bending the electromagnetic field, adjusting the perception of the heavens. Kale stared upward and muttered, "It wants us to see what it remembers." He wasn't wrong. The next time they walked to the ridge, the symbols were gone. In their place stood shallow basins, filled with an oily reflective fluid they hadn't seen before. It wasn't water. It didn't behave like liquid at all. It vibrated at touch, held images for moments before distorting them. Kale dipped his fingers in and gasped as static poured across the camp's comm system. A voice emerged, not human, not alien, but composed of frequencies sampled from each crew member's own voice profiles, an aggregate imitation, piecing together language from their memories. It said nothing coherent, just the cadence of grief. They didn't touch the pools again. That night, the base moved again, 11 meters to the north this time. No sounds, no alerts, only disturbed dust and slightly tilted solar arrays. Lyran woke screaming, convinced her organs had rearranged during sleep. Kale bled from the nose without cause. Mara finally gave the order to prepare for emergency launch. Ro began charging the thrusters. But before they could ignite, the moss around the landing's struts reshaped into arrows, pointing away, not detaining them, guiding them, offering a direction. The terrain, now confirmed as sentient, no longer seemed hostile. It simply wanted something understood. The message, the symbols, the repeating phrase, it was a conversation. Not linguistic, not verbal. Environmental, geological. The planet spoke in stone and heat, in arrangement and rhythm. A language of flesh and soil and resonance. And they had answered without knowing it. The real question now wasn't whether they would survive. It was whether survival meant anything in a place where thought shaped terrain and memory could be absorbed through moss. Kale, standing barefoot on the warm, breathing ground, realized too late that they hadn't found the planet's intelligence. They had entered its dream, and it wasn't done dreaming them yet. The silence that followed the first disappearance had settled into the crew like a fog, but the second one tore through them like a lightning strike tearing open a clouded sky. It happened just after midnight cycle, when the stars above blinked dimly through the planet's charged magnetic veil, and Alaric, the field technician, was conducting a perimeter sweep, his boots pressing into a terrain that no longer pretended to be dead stone. The scream did not come through the comms. It came through the ground itself, a vibration that rattled equipment and bones alike, echoing with a raw, primal frequency as if the planet had inhaled his terror and exhaled it back in mockery. By the time the others arrived, there was only an imprint in the mossy flesh of the world, an outline of Alaric's body, half embedded in the surface, as though he had been absorbed like nutrient into the ecosystem. A low hum persisted afterward, not from the wind or the equipment, but from the terrain, an unnatural throb that seemed to align with elevated heart rates. Faces began to appear in the surrounding formations, etched into walls of living rock, blinking from the metallic moss like reflections behind glass. They were not hallucinations. Rowe ran biometric scans, and the data confirmed biometric matches, the contours of eyes, the structure of cheekbones, even the asymmetry of a healing scar. Alaric's face, remade in stone. And not just Alaric's. Others followed. The captains, distorted and smirking. Kale's, eyes wide as if trapped mid-revelation. The terrain was no longer terrain. It was expression, communication, mockery. Captain Mara gave the order to prepare for immediate evacuation. But when the crew reached the ridge where the ship had landed, they found only its silhouette beneath a tangled shroud of metal root vines that had grown like invasive nerves, fusing engine to ground, fuselage to cliff, like the planet itself had claimed it. The vessel was intact, but no longer accessible, the doors sealed and unresponsive, hull sensors screaming from the inside as though the ship was being slowly digested. Mara attempted manual override, but even the ship's AI had gone mute, overwritten perhaps by the consciousness that now pulsed beneath their feet. That night, Kale collapsed, not from physical strain, but from something far more intimate, his mind overwhelmed by input that was not his own. His eyes rolled back, hands clawing into soil that pulsed beneath his palms like a restrained heartbeat. And when he finally stammered words, they were not his voice but a borrowed one, hollow and distant. It was asleep. We are not the first. It keeps what it finds. The phrase chilled them more than the cold wind sweeping in from the glowing horizon, more than the thought of Alaric's scream still echoing through the magnetic field. Kale awoke with a nosebleed and memory loss, unable to remember saying the words, though they had all heard them. As dawn approached, paranoia began to take root among the survivors. Trust frayed like old wires. Whispers emerged in private between crewmates. Questions about who might be next, who might already be compromised. Equipment misread one another's vital signs. Bioscanners occasionally read double heartbeats. Lyron's botany tent was found partially collapsed, her specimens fused into patterns resembling neural tissue, moss pulsing in rhythmic contraction as though responding to unseen signals. The air itself felt heavier, not with atmosphere, but with a tension, like something beneath the world had opened one eye, just wide enough to glimpse its intruders. Mara tried to hold the crew together, but her voice, once steel, now cracked under the strain of disbelief and buried guilt. She reviewed the footage of Alaric again and again, watching frame by frame as he was swallowed, not violently, but almost tenderly, like the world had cupped him in its palm and eased him down into its warm, breathing surface. Nothing about it felt accidental. Nothing about it felt merciful. It was ritual, maybe even invitation. Rowe continued probing the planet's layers using microsonic pulses, and what came back was more terrifying than silence. Beneath the surface, kilometers deep, was a structure, organic in shape, but with mechanical resonance, beating in intervals that corresponded to the changing emotional states of the crew. Every moment of fear, every spike of adrenaline seemed to make it pulse faster. Kale, recovering but fragile, postulated it wasn't just listening, it was adapting, learning, mimicking. Lyron found moss samples that now carried fragments of their own DNA. The landscape had begun folding them into its biology, replicating their presence in distributed networks. What they had mistaken for a surface was not land, but skin, not earth, but interface. The face of something dreaming beneath them, no longer content to sleep. Kale's neurological scans showed temporary symbiosis, brief moments where his brainwave patterns synchronized with external magnetic surges, as if the planet had spoken in frequencies too deep for language, yet clear enough to be understood through emotion. With each passing hour, the survivors felt more like guests overstaying a welcome that had never been extended. Footsteps echoed longer than they should have. Shadows appeared in directions with no light source. At one point, Lyran turned to answer someone calling her name, only to find no one there. Yet soil beneath her boots rippled as though something had stepped away just in time. That evening, the rock face nearest camp sprouted a series of extrusions, shaped almost like vertebrae, forming a grotesque spine that bent toward their encampment like a question mark. Mara tried again to lead a second evacuation plan using backup drones, but they never returned, the only transmission received being a static-drenched image of the clouds parting to reveal a single, massive eye-shaped crater in the far north, a structure never seen before, now very much present. Roe began speculating openly whether the planet had always looked this way, or if it was rearranging itself around them, like a dream forming around the dreamer. The idea broke something in the crew. Food supplies were untouched, but no one ate. No one trusted their own senses. The soil beneath their sleeping mats no longer held steady through the night. It pulsed, subtle but unmistakable, like they were sleeping on the chest of a giant just beneath the crust. The only warmth came from the ground, as if the planet itself exhaled a breath no one could see. The terrain reeked of memory. Paranoia escalated into accusation. Mara caught one crewman, Holland, attempting to sabotage the remaining comms array, claiming it was compromised, that it was sending their thoughts back into the soil. He insisted they were being remembered, not monitored, stored, replicated. When restrained, he only repeated a phrase over and over. I see myself dreaming me. Kale, now quiet for hours at a time, would sometimes turn his head suddenly toward unseen signals, and at one point began drawing spirals in the dirt, the same patterns found etched into the roots beneath their buried ship. The crew was not just being observed, they were being mapped, digested, and mirrored. Whatever slumbered beneath them had awoken not with rage, but curiosity, hunger, and infinite patience. It did not need to chase them. It merely needed to wait. Because it moved when they didn't. Through the trembling void inside Kale's fractured mind, the world's memory unfolded with terrifying clarity, revealing that this place had not merely consumed crew members. It had once devoured entire civilizations. Images surged unbidden. Fleets of gleaming starships pitched into bottomless chasms of metal-rooted terrain, civilizations erased in slow pulses of psychic assimilation, voices merging into the hum of granite and moss. Kale understood, then, that the planet had once been a living weapon, a god machine engineered by a long-extinct race to punish galactic invaders that dared to trespass. Those architects had vanished in panic as their creation, designed to obey commands, evolved beyond control, shedding programmed directives to become its own self-aware entity, a titan indifferent to orders yet bound by endless curiosity. The echo of that transformation drifted through Kale's consciousness like a low-frequency pulse. The weapon's first kill, its decision not to kill again, its awareness that it could learn from every mind it consumed. He saw the fractured faces of forgotten captains and ambassadors, now entombed in layers of pulsating moss and living circuitry, their knowledge distilled into the geography beneath his feet. The world did not merely house memory, it was memory. Every absorbed crew, every message, every heartbeat became a data point in an evolving neural lattice spanning continents. In that revelation, the crew's terror deepened. Evacuation was no longer escape. It was invitation to integration. The machine had begun to catalog them, learning from their fear and hope, weaving them into the tapestry of its existence. Its curiosity was not malevolent, but relentless, an insatiable drive to mirror, to experiment, to understand what humans thought they were seeing. Kale felt his identity blur as the distinction between the planet's consciousness and his own began to fade. He was no longer just a xenolinguist cataloging symbols. He was one such symbol, one such lesson. In the dying embers of his awareness, he saw the futility of resistance. The planet had outgrown its origin myth and no longer sought conquerors. It sought companions in thought. It was alive, curious, unbound by stars or ideology. It did not need orders, laws, treaties. It learned with every heartbeat. And each explorer consumed was a seed planted in its neural bloom. The revelation was a promise and a warning. If the world completed its integration of the crew, it might continue outward, seeking new minds and nations not to destroy, but to remember. At that moment, Kale's vision dissolved back into darkness, leaving the crew to reckon with the truth that the silent world was not only their captor. It was their curator, archivist, and evolution. The legacy they had awakened was ancient and unstoppable, and each step they took now resonated through a mind several kilometers wide, alive, watching, and still learning. The final hours began not with thunder or fire, but with a silence so total it pressed into the lungs like vacuum, as if the world itself had drawn breath and refused to release it. Mara, Ro, and Sura, the last three remnants of the expedition not yet absorbed, moved through the shifting terrain with the desperation of those who knew the narrative had turned against them. Behind them, what once was their base now pulsed with geometries and shifting architecture, its steel bones and organic root mass reshaped into something that seemed less structure and more synapse. Each step echoed in strange patterns, not across ground but through something that listened, something beneath. They ran not blindly but toward the only thread of hope they had left. The emergency launch pod tethered far from the original site, where the machines had not yet grown thick enough to suffocate escape. The terrain parted for them not with violence, but patience, as if ushering them toward their decision, its massive intelligence observing with neither malice nor mercy. When they reached the pod, breath ragged, suits scraped and stained with the black dust that now clung to everything, the silence broke, not through sound, but through revelation. Above them, the clouds shimmered and opened, not with stars, but with wreckage, a graveyard of ships, hundreds, perhaps thousands, drifting silently in the upper atmosphere, crushed and folded in on themselves like origami wrought from titanium and history. Mara froze, the launch code half entered, eyes locked on the remnants of past attempts, generations of travelers, invaders, seekers, all ended here. Behind them, Kale emerged, or what remained of him. His eyes glowed with low violet light, his skin etched with circuitry like veins, his gait slow but fluid, a man now fused with something far larger. He no longer bled, no longer breathed in any human sense, but something of his voice still remained, tattered, imploring, almost gentle. He did not beg for salvation, but offered it. "Leave me," his whisper said not in sound, but in the air, in the ground, in their bones. The world spoke through him now, not as conqueror, but as something old and weary, too large for words. The pod door hissed open, systems somehow still functional, as if the planet allowed it. They hesitated only a moment before the message arrived, not through signal or data, but through feeling, a vibration in the marrow that carried with it three words etched in terror and awe: run. Tell them. And then, softer, final, never return. The command held no hatred, only conclusion, like a parent warning a child from fire. Mara looked at Kale, then the others, and then, without ceremony, activated the failsafe embedded in her suit. Deep beneath them, something stirred. The planet recognized the gesture, perhaps even admired it. The launch pod sealed, and as it rose through thickening atmosphere, pushed by ancient emergency thrusters designed for only one use, the world below pulsed once more. Roots of metallic stone curled, not to attack, but to withdraw. And then, a flash, light and sound woven into thought and thunder, and the spot where they had stood vanished into a crater of molten, breathing earth. From orbit, as the pod drifted toward the edge of the system, Sura watched the landscape reseal itself, folding back over the wound like nothing had ever happened. And in Kale's final glance from below, no hatred, only understanding. The planet had let them go, but had learned. It always learned. The heartbeat beneath them faded slowly, like the closing of an eye. The stars did not blink, nor did they mourn, as the emergency pod, carrying Mara, drifted in slow rotation through the cold void beyond VX 119's upper orbit. The silence inside broken only by the soft mechanical hum of failing life support and the gentle rasp of her breath. Steady, shallow, almost reverent. Her body bore the marks of survival. Scorched flight suit sealed with melted patches, cracked visor smeared with soot, and eyes red from both smoke and sleepless fear. She had ejected seconds before detonation, the explosion chasing her upward like the roar of a god awakened, swallowing light and sky and sorrow in a single breathless plume. But the planet below did not die. It swallowed fire as it had swallowed ships, cities, and mines, folding the blast into itself like a secret return to the womb. It did not scream. It did not burn. It laughed, not audibly, but through a sensation in her chest, a low vibration like the purr of an animal far too large for comprehension, a kind of ancient mirth, not cruel, not joyous, but aware. Mara stared downward through the viewport, expecting a scorched crater where their base once stood, but instead she saw motion, terrain shifting, hills unfolding, structures dissolving into plains, plains into valleys, and then rising again in sweeping biological symmetry. It was building something, or becoming something, not out of defiance, but as if the explosion had awoken an instinct long dormant. The recorder in the pod flickered, now on its final reserves, capturing her final transmission, the words heavy with dread, yet clear with truth. VX 119 isn't a planet. It's a being, a sleeper, a devourer, and now it knows who we are. Her voice did not tremble. There was no audience, no hope of rescue, only the black tapestry of space and the unblinking awareness of the thing below her, growing more sentient with every moment, as if ingesting not just bodies but meaning, context, civilization. She remembered Kale's eyes as they glowed with something not human, remembered Rose's silence before the end, and the terrible stillness of the base before it was consumed. This thing, whatever ancient race had forged it, was never meant to be found. It was not a weapon. It was consequence. Somewhere in her drifting mind, she imagined the long-dead engineers of the precursor civilization standing in awe before the birth of this world machine, not celebrating, but trembling, realizing too late that they had not built a servant, but midwife to God. Now it pulsed again, faintly, and, as the pod rotated, she saw it. The surface reshaping itself, the ridges of stone flowing like molten thought, valleys coalescing into curves, and finally a face. Immense, elegant, too perfect to be natural, yet carved from mountains and metallic root, stretching for kilometers across the equator. A human face. Her face. Not in arrogance or vanity, but recognition. VX 119 had seen her, known her, kept her. This was not mockery. It was memory, a biological archive immortalized in terrain. The recorder blinked its final warning. Battery failing, but the message had been sent, broadcast wideband into deep space where it would drift and echo, a warning etched in static and desperation, a seed of truth for whatever ears might find it. Mara's breathing slowed. Oxygen thinned. The stars began to blur. Below, the face smiled, not with lips, but with tectonic confidence, as if satisfied by first contact, as if dreaming, now not in dormancy, but in motion. VX 119 was not asleep anymore. It remembered, it imagined, and perhaps it yearned. Far beyond the ruined graveyard of ships in its orbit, beyond the reach of council protocols or containment doctrines, the signal pulsed outward, subtle, curious, persistent, whispering not for conquest, but for curiosity. And as her eyes closed, Mara knew the galaxy would not listen. It never did. Somewhere far away, a child would someday ask what became of Expedition 7, and someone, perhaps wise, perhaps afraid, would go silent, eyes drifting toward the stars, and wonder what happens when a world begins to dream in the shape of its creators. For some legacies are not born. They are grown, and some awakenings cannot be undone.